Hey everybody, welcome back to Exit Podcast. Today's special guest is Chris McShanag. He's CEO and founder of Virtual Teammate. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here. How are you today?
Very well. Thank you so much for making time for us. I guess let's kind of start at the beginning. Let's talk a little bit about who you are and what you do and why we're talking today.
Certainly. Yeah. No, Chris McShanag, blessed originally from Australia. Funny story, came over here single many years ago. Now married, 4 kids, 3 grandkids. So I guess I'm here to stay. I told my mum I'd be here for 3 years, and it's been a little longer than that. I'm the founder and CEO of Virtual Teammate. We're a global remote staffing organization focused, primarily in the healthcare space. We do have clients in the business space. A number of our healthcare clients have pulled us into, but focusing really helping doctors, dentists, and veterinary clinics really grow their practice without having to grow their staff, and really focus on the right outcomes to support them from a administrative standpoint so they can do what they do best and focus on patient care.
Oh, I love that. Well, thank you for laying that out for us. I think that'll be a great place for us to end up. But let's talk a little bit about just sort of your entrepreneurial background. So let's talk about getting into business in the first place. What does your sort of life story as a business person look like?
So yeah, as I said, I came from the Australia. I was with IBM, came over here as an expat, like I said, for 3 years, and then really enjoyed being over here in the States and took an opportunity to join a company. We went through an IPO and then ultimately a sale of that business, and then really got the entrepreneurial spirit way back from my father, who had a metal recycling company. And then we went out on our own, really focusing the asset intensive industry. While doing that, it became very apparent to me as I got involved with Ronald McDonald House Charities that there was really a unique need in the healthcare space. And so I grew a consulting company focused in helping health systems, hospitals, practices to really grow from a technology and process. But what I learned, Ryan, through that process is I can give all the technology, I can give all the process improvements, but what the doctors were always telling me and the dentists is they struggle with finding good people and getting their time back. And so for me, it really transformed my thinking on how do I help and make a difference and a legacy in the healthcare space. And so I pivoted the business, sold the consulting company, and focused on really providing remote support for healthcare folks. Because if you think about in the last 10 years, we've gone from 5% of our workforce being remote to well over 60% right now. And so for me, it was really about how could I make a difference? And so that's really been my entrepreneurial spirit, is really growing to look at what's the problem, what do the customers really need, and how do I fulfill that need? And in the healthcare space, it's clearly finding and attracting and retaining top talent to really handle those back office administrative functions so doctors, MAs, medical office managers can do what they do best and take care of patients and really enhance our healthcare system.
I love that. So you mentioned, your father was entrepreneurial himself. You sort of, I guess, maybe learned from his example in some regard. Obviously worked for the blue chip companies like the IBMs and things like that, and then decided to strike out on your own. For a lot of people, this is a really difficult transition, right? Moving from relative security, like, a job, to something that's a little bit more out there. But it seems like maybe you're driven by passion or driven by this notion that you really thought you could do good in the world. Can you talk a little bit about maybe just sort of those early steps, and maybe this has happened more than once in your career, where you stepped away from sort of, I guess, set income or guaranteed income and moved into trying to run a business on your own?
It's an interesting point you make, stability. I'm a big proponent of controlling my own destiny. As you can kind of see in the background there, Ryan, I'm a big fan of kind of Formula One. And so for me, it's about really controlling your destiny. And so I think it's the biggest superpower, and probably my biggest superheroes are those that start businesses, because it provides an opportunity to add value. Not just value materially, which is hugely important, but I think emotional value creation, which is about really in building a culture. And then spiritual value creation is about improving a community. And so anybody who starts a company and hires people, I think is a superhero in my mind. And so for me, I always saw it as an opportunity to step out and trust in myself and really, kind of bet on myself. And that's always been kind of a mantra that both my father and my grandfather said, controlling your own destiny is a key point, but also surrounding yourself with highly qualified people is another key thing. And so for me, it's been a really exciting journey to kind of surround myself with good people, but also at the same time, really control where I feel like the biggest need is. Because I think in some of these big blue chips, you can get lost, right? And the entrepreneurial spirit can be dulled down, and you're not really fixing the problems that are the most important, but you're just kind of moving the paperwork around a little bit.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Well, and I love the comparison to F1. I mean, obviously, that's a really fast acting kind of business. Decisions are critical, these kinds of things. It's obviously big money kind of business, So, I mean, it's obviously, I guess, the spirit of them. We had a guy on the show not too long ago, Chris Bokosis, who's a fighter pilot, Australian fighter pilot, by the way. But he, same kind of deal. I mean, a lot of people, I think, they're maybe speed junkies or they get caught up in the speed of the thing. But for him, a big part of it was sort of the iterative process of running a fighter jet, right? I mean, you're moving
Right.
incredibly fast. There is no stop. There is only go. So if that's the case, and that's kind of life, I mean, there really is no stop. It's really all go, and as long as the clock's ticking, this is what we got. And so I think that, to your point, in controlling your own destiny, I mean, having the opportunity to, I guess, work it out in real time and move from thing to thing, and chase down stuff that, in pursuit of maybe an ultimate goal. In the case of F1, it's a finish line, or in fighter piloting, it's a target somewhere. But in the case of business, it might be an objective to do good for the world, or to, introduce some sort of new product or service or whatever.
Exactly.
So I think that that's really interesting how that sort of ties back to your map, which is just this notion of really chasing down the things that are interesting to you.
Yeah, controlled speed, right? It's interesting. I was talking to a doctor the other day, one of my clients, and he's a surgeon. And he said, and we were talking a little bit about F1. He said, actually, surgeons have in the past engaged teams from Formula One to help them improve their operating room. You think about a pit stop, how much is going on at the same time. And so really coordinating that. And so it's amazing when you think about, like you said, the parallels. And it's the same when you go into business as an entrepreneur, right? You can't do everything by yourself, right? You can't be the driver, the pit stop, and everything. So it is about really creating the teams, but it's also about clearly articulating the outcomes. And so I think as an entrepreneur, the best work you can do, and as a CEO, is to responsibly continually add value to the business and to engage teammates that are doing the same thing. And so for me, I'm really wanting to be very clear about self and social awareness and being really good at communicating, but always thinking about what does the client want? Not so I've got this cool technology, how do I force it to a client, but the other way around. And so my entrepreneurial journey is really always about what's the problem you're trying to solve and how can we best fulfill that problem and provide that solution versus obviously trying to do anything or everything. And I love your analogy about the plane, right? Because you're always constantly moving forward. You don't have a choice. And it's the same thing as an entrepreneur, right? You've always got to be taking that next best step to move forward.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, and so along the way, as you mentioned, I mean, obviously one of the big problems people run into is staffing. Hiring is difficult, and a lot of people struggle with that. But I think sometimes people think the problem is finding good people, but in reality, the problem is actually leadership and systems. And there's actually problems internal that are keeping people from making the right hires, for example. So I wondered if, in your own experience, if you could just talk about this. Obviously, surrounding yourself with a team is a key tenet of what you do now professionally, but also what you were doing when you were getting your businesses spun up. And so can you talk a little bit about just sort of what hiring looks like, the factors and the pieces and parts that go into assembling a team that is great?
So it's a revolving model, and one that's continuing evolving with us as well, because we get anywhere from 200 to 500 people apply every month to come to work with us. Because in building the business, my focus is enhancing the client experience, but also enhancing the virtual teammate experience to work with us and earn a living wage. And so we're very intentional, not just to look at the technical skills, which is really important, and the speech and comprehension, but also understand the behavioral hardwired traits. And so we embrace the cultural index, which gives us a really good, well-rounded view of how people, kind of approach things in different situations. It's not a personality test. It's really how you react in certain work situations. And so for me, it's about really understanding that. But more importantly, it's about the traits, right? The behavior and leadership traits you have, how you show up and turn up every day. And so we have kind of a matrix that we go through that determines that we really want to target folks that at any point in time, 50% of our team is performing or achieving high in the top 10% of our biggest competitors. For me, that's a really key one. And so there's a cultural line, but there's also behavioral traits, right? How you show up, how you present yourself, and also managing, to your point, kind of communications about expectations. How do you align expectations and focus on outcomes, right? Not on what are the job requirements, but what are the outcomes you want to drive? What are the capabilities that you're looking for this person? And therefore, what are the duties? And then how do you measure those? Because I'm a big proponent of focusing on outcomes, not necessarily job descriptions. And that's how we very intentionally recruit and retain and hire our folks within Virtual Teammate.
When you're starting to advise companies then on doing these things, I mean, obviously that's sort of your internal practice and it might be the right one, but what are the biggest mistakes that you see businesses making before they start hiring at this stage?
I think the biggest mistake we see, and a big part of what we do, is we provide a client success manager that kind of nurtures this onboarding process. I think the biggest one that we see is they try and improve or accelerate a process that isn't quite working, or they look to kind of have a person do everything. I truly believe teams now, as I mentioned, have kind of moved from everybody in the office to being remote, but your team is now here, near, and far. Here, there's definitely a need to have folks in the office. And I think sometimes we try and force people into roles that aren't appropriate. Near, you do need people remotely, like I'm in Phoenix, Arizona. Where are you today, Ryan?
I'm in Salt Lake City.
Salt Lake City. So you're in Salt Lake City. So we're near to each other, but we're not obviously in the same office. And then far, leveraging teams we have around the globe. And so I think it's about really architecting the team correctly and having the right people in the right seats. Because for me, it's very important that you focus in those areas, because the highest and best value use of your time isn't the best and highest value use of, say, somebody who's working remotely. And so that's really a key focus for us, is really making sure you have the right people, but also not just the right people, but in the right seats with the right focus of outcomes.
Yeah, no, I think that's
We
really
advise our
smart.
clients very similarly on that, because in a hospital setting, or I should just say an ambulatory setting, it's really important. You've got to have the doctors, the MAs, the receptionists at the front desk to greet people, but do they need to be answering phones? Do they need to be on the call with insurance companies? Well, no, that's not the highest and best for use of their time. That's where you can leverage other teammates, because you think about the definition of a team as a group of individuals working towards a common goal.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Well, and I think that, if we're keeping with our F1 metaphor, I mean, each person on the team has a very specific job, right? You've got your guys that are responsible for detaching and reattaching wheels. You got people, adding fuel to the vehicle, and should it be the pilot's job or the driver's job to sit and worry about those little things, or should they be able to rely on their person to do that job while they go and do their job, or
Yeah,
back to
exactly.
our fighter pilot, like, is it the job of the fighter pilot, mid mission, to be worrying about, well, man, did they do that oil change, or like, where are we at on this thing? They put gas in this thing. And so, I mean, yes, I mean, there's some, I guess, leadership. So if we're going to try and put the pilot or the driver of the F1 car at the top of the chain as like the leader or the CEO of that car, let's say,
Yep.
then, in that regard, okay, they should have some peripheral awareness. I did check the gas. I know I have gas before I took off. The car seems to have tires on it, that kind of thing.
Yep.
And so, so there is some awareness that should be had, but at the same time, each individual has their own job, and each individual is also kind of aware of each other's jobs. And I think that helps build a stronger team. You've got this network of people that are working for one common good, even though everybody's doing their own thing.
Exactly. I mean, I don't know if you follow F1, and I know it's July 20th. There was a race this weekend, and it just kind of reiterated your point, Ryan, where the big racer, Lewis Hamilton, pulls into the pits, gets a pit stop. They change the tires, they put fuel in. There was a gentleman responsible for adjusting the front of the vehicle. Well, he wasn't paying attention. And so he went to adjust it. At the same time, Lewis Hamilton got the green light to go, and he went and he ran over the top of the guy. So it just shows you, right? There's self-awareness, but everybody has a role. And as a driver, your focus is, okay, green light, go. You're not looking everywhere else. And so if everybody's not clear on their jobs and their responsibilities, things can go right. Now, blessing is the guy's okay, but it's a good example of being very clear and owning your outcome-based responsibility, right? His outcome-based responsibility was to fix the front wing. The driver's was to drive, the guys to do the gas. So you are so right there, Ryan, that I think the best thing for leaders is communication and clarity on that communication and level setting expectations. And entrepreneur, you can tend to want to do everything yourself. And that's probably been one of my biggest learnings is, you get to a point where you realize, like, I can't do everything. But when I delegate, I've got to be very clear, and this is what we work with our clients on, is what's urgent and what's important, right? If it's urgent and important, that's the best thing for the founder. If it's urgent and maybe not important, that's the best thing to kind of be delegating folks to. If it's not urgent, not important, then that's something you should be deleting, right? And having somebody kind of educate somebody and help deleting those things off your task. And things that are important but maybe not urgent, kind of being able to have clarity on how do you defer those things. So it's really those 4Ds that we teach our clients on, and to really help them better understand that. So do, delete, defer, and delegate.
Yeah, no, I love that. And that little I guess, framework there is, I think, so critical for understanding where to start delegating things. And it's funny, like even listening to you talk now, just thinking about my own business and the struggles I've had in my business to try and find people, because I've ended up, for the last 20 years, really, I was kind of the entrepreneur at the middle with a network of people who were supporting me around the outside.
Mm.
And at the first of the year, we made this pivot and launched a new company, and also in the healthcare space, sort of a consultancy. And, but I'm trying to move to a position where I'm kind of moved out of the middle, right? Part of that is age related. I would like to have something I could maybe sell one day, and I have to move myself out of the
Right.
middle. But what I'm starting to discover is the problems that I have either in letting things go and letting somebody else take responsibility for that, item that I'm used to running, or even being able to really delegate stuff off that well, which is that it's like I know how it works in my head, but I haven't documented these things, or I don't have systems in place, or I don't have whatever it is. And so it's made it really challenging to find people who can support me. So it's like, I guess like cognitively, I can go, I need help and I've got to find help. But then when it gets down to the actual brass tacks of trying to find somebody, I don't even know who I'm looking for. So to
Right.
that end, what's the first thing you start looking for to or looking at when a business comes to you and they say, "Hey, man, we're trying to scale. We think it's time, and we're having trouble finding good people. We'd like to explore your route."
It's a great question, Ryan. And one that sounds like you're wrestling as well. It's like, what are the outcomes you want to drive? It's either one of two things. It's like I'm struggling to grow, meaning I'm struggling on the top of the funnel, right? Which is sales, marketing, really getting clarity on how do I get brand awareness and out in the market. Or it's on the back end that says there's these administrative tasks that are really holding me back. And so we really talk to clients about, let's do an audit on what's really holding your business back the most, and what are the outcomes you want to drive. So on the growth side, I want to get to 50, fresh leads a month, or I want to get to 100 calls, a month, whatever it might be. And so let's talk about what's holding you back. Who's doing that today? And quite often the founder says, "Well, I do that." Okay, let's think about it. Is that the highest and best value use of your time? And thinking about it from that perspective. Or if it's on the back end, we'll talk about, okay, what's holding the business? Well, I can't get invoices out on time, or I can't, I've got these podcasts I can't get edited on time, or, I'm struggling with keeping up with meetings and schedules, or my finances are out of whack. Those will really talk about what are the outcomes you want to drive, what success look like, and then we talk about, okay, what are the capabilities that we have that can support that? And sometimes we may say to a client, we would recommend a different option, but most of the time it's really those back office administrative tasks that we can handle. And so in the clinical space, it's about, my claims are getting out of control, my AR days are growing. Patients are not showing up. Patients are complaining about not being able to get in touch with their doctors. So that's what we talk about, those sort of things. Okay, now I understand that. We have a team that's really focused in those areas that we can provide and bring support to you. And then we talk about, okay, what are the daily tasks? And then what we do is we match them up with a highly skilled individual who is AI enabled. And then we provide a client success manager and make sure you maximize those services. So that's really the process we take our clients through. And it really starts with, what are the outcomes you want to drive? What does success look like? And then let's talk about what are the capabilities that we can align to help you get there.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And I think it's good that people start to understand that too, because I think that taking that moment and doing the little self audit, I think is really important, especially if you're, maybe a small practice in your case, or like an entrepreneur that runs a small business and is interested in using virtual resources, whether that's, through a platform like yours or through any of these, myriad platforms out there for different kind of experts around the world.
Correct.
I think that there's also, though, some difference between sort of working with in-person humans versus remote work. And one of them you already keyed in on is communication. But I wondered if you'd talk a little bit specifically about the challenges that exist between like sort of a virtual person and a in-house person.
Correct. Yeah. So I think some of the challenges that our clients tend to ask about is, how do I know that they're working? How do I know that they're producing? And so what we do is we do an end of day report, an end of week report, and we're very clear on, once we agree up front, what are the outcomes you want to drive? And let's take, for example, I want 10 leads a month, or 10 leads a week. Then we're reporting on that. Okay, how are we achieving against those 10 leads? Or I need 30 claims performed a day, or 50 claims performed a day. So we are really clearly articulating what is the results that are being driven. And on top of that, we provide productivity reporting for our clients. So they know that the team's being productive, working on the right things, focused on the right activities. That's probably one of the biggest areas. And then we have a client playbook on how best to leverage your virtual teammate, right? How to engage them, what are the right tasks, what's the best way to communicate, and the best way to kind of engage. And so for us, that's really how we nurture that sequence. And then one of the other things is, like I said, we dedicate a client success manager who's your point of contact to really work with you on a day-to-day basis to ensure you're maximizing the services. So that's really, I think, the three key steps that we go through. Clearly, I understand what success looks like and the outcomes at the onboarding. We track against that. We provide clarity around the productivity and the work they're doing, and then we have a support mechanism in place that supports you throughout that process.
Well, I think that's really clever, and it's probably something I imagine that came from either research or expertise. But hiring somebody or having somebody on your side whose sole purpose is to help you maximize getting your service. Because I've been remote for a lot of years, and during COVID and all that time frame, I was doing a lot of coaching on how to do remote work for people. And this is one of the big things: is that people would buy somebody who was off site, and then to your point, they were going, "Well, God, are they even working? Like, I don't even know what they're doing. They're just off in Indonesia someplace or something, and we don't even know if they're actually doing anything." So I think not only is it about that sort of reporting and making sure that they're reporting back on whatever deliverables they're supposed to be doing, but more than that, I think is actually being taught how to maximize your performance with that person. Because I think a lot of times, remote workers start to get forgotten. They
Right.
become a place where we're spending money, but we're not feeling like we're getting what we want out of it. And in a lot of cases, it's the employer's fault. It's not even the remote workers' problem. And so I think it's kind of interesting. I mean, because there's just a different dynamic between the remote workers and the in-house people. And like you said, I mean, so many people are much more, I guess, comfortable with the notion of working remote now, but that had to be for sure something that was a solution born out of a problem, I have to imagine.
True, and we also, on the flip side, have a success coach that works with our virtual teammates to really help them. Because, to your point, Ryan, quite often, the virtual teammate needs to be encouraged to reach out and say, "Hey, I have capacity, or I can help more," or really identify areas that they could continue to add value in. Because it's really an evolutionary process. Because obviously, over first 30, 60 days, you kind of getting used to each other, working together. But as the productivity improves, then there's more opportunity to take on more. I mean, I can confidently say, based on the reporting we provide to our clients, that we're about 47% more productive than having somebody in the office. Okay, well, if you have that bandwidth capacity, what are we doing with that, right? And how do you best leverage that moving forward?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Yeah, they just don't seem to have the same distractions as somebody in the office. They're not getting tied down in so many meetings and things like that. And,
And
just
multiple
the,
tasks, right? Where
yeah,
they're
yeah.
wearing multiple hats.
Yeah, I love that. So let's talk a little bit, and you've already kind of dipped our toes into this a little bit, but what separates the leaders who succeed with remote teams from those who fail? Like, what are the things that people are doing that are the wrong thing to be doing with your virtual team?
I think the ones that are really successful have very clear process and procedures. And also the tasks that they leverage their virtual teammates for are very highly process oriented and repetitive, really and consistent. So, in the medical space, it's insurance verification, eligibility, billing, patient scheduling, patient medical scribing. On the business side, it's really bookkeeping, legal side, which is very process oriented and repetitive process. I think where sometimes folks get a little has some difficulty is when they're asking our virtual teammates or folks remotely to kind of act more as executives and creative and strategic. And so that's really kind of outside those boundaries because they're not there interacting, having those collaborative conversations real time within the kind of the founders inner circle, focusing on that. And I think that's what we do up front is we clearly articulate what are the outcomes you want to drive, and therefore what are the capabilities that we bring, and being very clear on that because I think you can get to a point where you're expecting somebody who is 6,000 miles away to be kind of your chief of staff, your right hand person. And that's not always the best. That's the best use of your folks kind of within the office to kind of build strategy, and the teams remotely is best on execution.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, in sort of a related point, and one of the bigger challenges with working with people remotely is how do you build culture when your team isn't in the same room? And especially with outsourced teams like this, where they're not necessarily an employee of the company, but maybe they're being asked to kind of work or live with inside the company's culture. There are a lot of versions of this, especially during COVID, where they were doing all these virtual meetups, or they were sending out packages of things and stuff like that to try and get people to align. I mean, God, we saw just about every iteration of that, I think. But when you're working with somebody that's VA, and you're working with somebody that is, not really attached to the company, so to speak, is there a way to really build or include them in sort of company culture, and so that they understand what the expectations are around the people you work with?
Definitely. I mean, that's why intentionally I formed the business and called it Virtual Teammate, because you are one team. And so we really encourage our clients to treat the virtual teammates as if they're one team. So, logins within the same systems, communications, attendance to team meetings, all those things are hugely important. And so we encourage our clients to do that. And we do kind of virtual coffees and virtual meet and greets. We'll do situations with some of our clients where we'll provide, bagels or donuts to the office, coffee to the office, and essentially have a team party, right? Where we're funding the food and things, and then having everybody together and do a virtual meeting or a virtual celebration, which we do internally, right? And so once a month, we're meeting with all of our teams around the globe and doing kind of a gamification. That's what I found to be most successful. If you really make it more of a game and enjoyable, because I think winning's fun, and winning in business is even more fun. And so, how do you make that more enjoyable and more engaging, and provide opportunities where the virtual teammates are facilitating the sessions versus maybe it's always somebody in the office that's rotating that, so they start to feel like part of the business and they're engaged in the creation. Because I will tell you, teams around the globe love to speak with, engage with folks around the world. And that's our goal, is how to enhance the experience of clients, but also enhance the experience of virtual teammates as well.
I think that's a really interesting point you make, and I'd never even really thought about that. This notion of maybe turning the engagement around and letting the virtual person guide something in a business. That's a really interesting way of looking at it, and I think also a great way to really include them in the business, because I think so much of it is that. Now, granted, I work primarily with freelance people, but it's sort of a shade of virtual. And so with freelance people, in some cases you get folks that just aren't really interested in that. They're here, they want to do the job. They're here to execute. And the reason they're doing work virtually is because they don't care. They just want to be able to do this thing. Maybe they're really great, I don't know, maybe they're great at doing bookkeeping or something. And so they're going to do their bookkeeping for the day, and then they just want to leave and be done with it. Right. But I think, probably and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine that the virtual assistants who do the best are the ones that do actually take an interest in what you're doing and are actually trying to engage. I mean, this is their form of business. This is how they make money. And so if they're engaged actively, I imagine those workers go further faster than those who are maybe just kind of there to cash a check.
Correct. And those that share, right? I mean, I think what I've found the most success with our clients is getting to know your virtual teammate, like, sharing a little personal information, here's where I live, here's my family, because that's, I think, the most important thing, and that's about building emotional value creation, right? It's about building the community. It's about providing opportunities to earn a living wage and getting to know your teammates. Excuse me, that's really what got me excited into this business, is getting to meet some of the folks in the Philippines and the difference you can make. Particularly, for example, nurses in the Philippines on average travel 1.5 to 2 hours to the hospital one way. So that means 4 hours away from their family. And we're able to, essentially, provide a living wage for them that's about 60% more than they could learn in a hospital. So they're getting back 4 hours of their time, and they're earning more money and allowing them to stay, in the Philippines or in Latin America or wherever we have our team, versus having to travel to the US, Canada, Australia, England to provide for their family. So it's a huge difference. And I think sharing the difference in their lives, and the clients doing the same thing, right? Sharing how they'll be able to buy back their time, maybe spend more time with their family, I think is huge. And then it becomes really a global culture and a global team.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the virtual teammates are AI enabled. Can we talk a little bit about what that means? Especially, right now, I mean, I think we're in this weird transition with the phrase AI or the term AI, where for a lot of people that might sound like, oh, okay, well, they're just offshoring everything to, Claude or ChatGPT. And, there's just some operator on the other end running ChatGPT for me, So what does that actually mean in terms of, and especially in businesses that are highly regulated, medical practices, things like this, where record keeping and privacy is really key. What does it actually look like, or what does it mean to have a AI enabled virtual teammate?
So our big focus, Ryan, is really about AI productivity with human accountability. I think when it comes to AI, whether it be in our space or really in any business space, AI is a huge productivity opportunity. And I think like any productivity tool we see, there's going to be a natural pendulum swing. We've probably swung a fair way, and we'll come back. To me, when you think about AI, it's about what is the intention, what is the wisdom that goes into it. I mean, AI is only really as good as the inputs and prompts you put into it and how you manage that. And so what we've built is really agents that can work, within your organization to allow AI productivity, but also there's a human accountability, particularly in the healthcare space. We've seen issues recently on the AI side where people have implemented AI completely on medical scribing, and there's been medical errors. So you've got to have that accountability in that review process. Similarly on the finance side, right, where we've seen AI agents have run too far ahead, and then you've got financial issues. And so for us, it's about providing tools to our virtual teammates to be more productive, but still having that human accountability to review and confirm the accuracy. I think I've seen too many presentations. I'm sure you've seen the same, where somebody generates an AI presentation and then just sends it out, and it's not accurate and information's not right. It's about that accountability and review. And obviously, as we refine the tools, they'll get better. But I still see the need to have productivity with AI, which is huge. But I think there's an accountability piece that we need to embrace as a society, so that we're not kind of getting too far ahead and just essentially delegating all that responsibility to an AI agent.
Yeah,
So
no,
we
it's
do
a
that
really
very
good point.
intentionally on the insurance side, because about 70% of our insurance verifications are kind of highly process oriented, but there's about 30 that require complexity. And so really, like any business, focusing on the 30 that adds the most value.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense, and that does seem like the right use of AI, which is just as a tool to make people better. But to your point about prompting and things like that, and I've seen this in my own experience, or even like with my own children. Like, AI is great and AI is really powerful, but if you don't know what you're talking about, it's really easy to get steered off course. And so, I think by having people who are already highly qualified experts, in your virtual teammate pool, then enabling them with something that's a productivity boost to them. But they already have the knowledge, they already have the expertise to be able to go back and look at those reports or look back at those documents and ensure that things are accurate, is absolutely critical to make AI work. So to that end, on just looking at the opposite of it, where does AI still fall flat in this, and where do you think human intervention is still where it is?
So I'm sorry, you cut out there for a second. Say that
Oh
again.
yeah, no, I was just asking. So so AI is great, AI is powerful, all that stuff. But where does AI still fall flat in terms of really we still need humans to do this stuff?
I think it's in that unstructured data space, I think, is where AI and that critical thinking that needs to go in. I think AI is a great research tool and a productivity tool, but it still requires wisdom. It still requires you insight and your industry knowledge. What I love about AI is you can query people that are both living and passed away, right? And get good insights, and maybe create it as a checkpoint for you. But it's never going, I don't see it fully replacing some of the key decision making that needs to come on board. I think it's really good on the processes and SOPs and things like that to create. But I think AI, if you let it run, I'll give you an example. Right, I was part of a mastermind group, and a CEO was giving his presentation, right, his new strategy, and I'm like, that looks very familiar to Six Sigma, and that looks, and so like there was pieces and parts in his presentation that were since taken. I said, did you have AI create? He goes, yeah, isn't it amazing? I'm like, yeah, but it's not original thinking, and it also reinforces whatever you're thinking. So to your point, Ryan, it can take you down the wrong path, right? It just reinforces the prompts that you're putting in there instead of really challenging you back. And so prompting, saying, don't tell me what I want to hear, tell me what's the best thing. I think that's the key piece where I think it falls down, because it can just reinforce your same notions versus challenging you, because it's built essentially to verify and justify kind of your thoughts, because it gets to know you and it says, well, this is what you like, and so this is what I'm going to respond back.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So we've been talking a lot about like why virtual teammates might be a good idea for your company, but what's a good reason not to use somebody like this? So, and we did, I think, touch on this a little bit at the beginning of the show, but maybe let's talk about just like, virtual teammate might be the right way to go, or hiring somebody virtually might be the way to go for some companies, but maybe not for others. So in what cases is it not a good fit to use somebody virtual?
I think you mentioned a little bit some of the industries that are highly regulated. Maybe in the Air Force, or sorry, aerospace area where it's highly regulated, and obviously has to be US based. And then sometimes that's where it struggles. Also, think in that higher level critical thinking, it makes more sense to have folks either in your office here or near, that are well aligned to what you are trying to achieve in creative thinking. That's where I think it's not the best fit, because that's the best fit really for an entrepreneurial leader to take ownership and responsibility for. And that's what we focus on, is really thinking about, okay, what's the best work you can do? And let's really focus on that. How do we make more time for that? And then delegate those tasks that aren't the highest and best value use of your time. And we talk to a lot of our clients based on kind of that buyback mentality from Dan Martell that says, how many of your $100 resources are doing $10 tasks? And so thinking about, okay, we get those $10 tasks off. Now that allows your $100 resource to focus on more strategic, kind of focusing on process improvement, new product launches, new product engineering. That's the best use of their time. And so that's where I don't think it makes sense. But what I do see is it makes sense to offload tasks from those folks so they have more time to focus on those.
I love that. Is there any place though that were you seeing where entrepreneurs are outsourcing things way too early? So, for example, a founder or somebody like that, maybe a small organization, they decide, I'm ready to hire, I'm ready to start bringing people on. But is there a time that maybe is too premature, or are there type of tasks that people is beginning to outsource too soon?
I think on the lead generation side, if you don't have a clear message and a clear kind of scripting and triggering in your sales lead, top of the funnel sales and marketing, that's where you can get a little too far ahead of yourself. And so I think the best use of the virtual teammates is once you have clear, messaging, clear strategies, clear branding, and clear trigger messages and workflows, that's when it's best to bring your virtual teammate in. And so we talk to a lot of our clients that maybe a little early and say, here's what we would recommend you focus on, get these things in place first. And then, I think you can force multiply that. Otherwise, as I talked about at the beginning, you end up, over productizing a really bad process. And so I think that's where I would encourage folks that are considering this to make sure that they take a look internally. Do I have the right processes and SOPs in place that I could hand off to somebody? Kind of like what you were talking about earlier, Ryan, about am I in a place where I'm in the middle of the business? How do I get out of the middle of the business, but clearly document what I do today so I could hand that off to somebody?
Okay. Yeah, no, I love that. So I'd like to pivot back a little bit just to sort of your entrepreneurial career. And I wanted to talk about just some of the hardest lessons that you've learned about in building your own business. Obviously, you've come some way from where you began and you've gone sort of through the corporate route and then back to entrepreneurship and so on. So I wonder if you talk about just some of the stumbling blocks and things that you've had to overcome along the way, some of the bigger challenges you've encountered, just in running a business like this.
Yeah, I think it really comes back to, in some of my business, I didn't do a great job up front building the right team around me, and understanding kind of some of my blind spots and where I needed support and guidance. And so having really clear social and self-awareness on what you're good at and what you're not good at. And so for me, marketing hasn't always been my biggest strength. And so, I really enjoy having conversations like this with folks, but getting in front of the right people, driving that self-awareness hasn't been the best, skill set of mine. And so really, finding a strong partner that can support you in that and building the right team around you, I think is one of the biggest areas. And by doing that is really being clear on what are the outcomes you want to drive, right? When you talk with a marketing company, it's about, I don't just want leads, I want high quality leads that convert to clients. It's a subtlety, but I think it's a really important thing. So being very clear on that message. I think the other one is making sure if you're an entrepreneur and you're very fast paced and you go very quickly, and I've noticed this in my experience, you want to make sure you have people that ground you and I really have attention to detail when that's not your biggest area of strength. And so I'm a big proponent of leaning into your strengths and really supporting and finding folks that enhance your weaknesses. Versus the other way, I think the best work you can do is improve on your strengths going from, say, a 7 to an 8 versus taking a weakness and going from, say, a 4 to a 5. And so I think one of my biggest lessons learned is doing that. I think the other that I think is the biggest lesson is getting involved in a mastermind group that is small enough, and I'm in a group called Execute where there's 6 members, that you can really pour into each other and have business and detailed knowledge versus these larger groups that I think some entrepreneurs get involved in, which they try and treat more as a networking group. And I think there's time for networking groups, but I think as a CEO, it can be and a founder, it can be quite a lonely business. So really making sure you surround people that challenge you and are very intentional to focus on, improvement, not just kind of being part of the group.
Yeah. You sort of maybe alluded to some of these things, personal weaknesses and stuff that caused you problems on the way up. Can you talk about something that somebody might characterize as a failure or something that ended up actually making the business better? One of the things that popped to mind just from this conversation was the introduction of having a manager there who can help you maximize your account. That maybe not. Maybe I'm just making this up on your behalf, but it does make sense to me that it might come from a pain point to introduce a person like that to make sure that your clients are maximizing their relationship with virtual teammate. So I wonder if there's something along the way, and failure is a big scary word. Like, it doesn't have to be anything so dire, but is there anything along the way that really was a hiccup that you recognized that you were immediately able to sort of jump on and fix to make the business better?
So you've very insightful, Ryan. That was one of them, right? Where I was doing a lot of sales calls, a lot of stuff up front early on in the business growth, and then clients keep coming back to me, right? And which I love and love to talk with our clients, but it's not the best use because I couldn't be as responsive as having dedicated teammates, who could really focus on that. So that was definitely a failure that turned into a success. I think the other one for me is making sure you have really clear alignment on culture. And a lot of people talk about culture, but for me, it's about the behavioral traits and the leadership traits. And so for me, it's about hiring based on those. And so probably one of the failures I think I may have had in the past is hiring people for their skill set and capabilities that weren't quite the right cultural fit, behavioral fit. And while that really helped the business grow exponentially, it had a kind of a cancerous effect and ultimately, became a problem. And so I think identifying those early and getting really good clarity on those is key. And so that's probably one of the failures that I think turned into a positive for me, is really being extra clear, not just on the technical side. And that's when we brought in kind of the cultural index to really look at how they behaviorally hardwired traits, how do they really focus on the best work.
Okay. The last thing I want to kind of needle you with on this entrepreneurial jag here is, is there anything in sort of maybe it's philosophical, maybe it's in a leadership style, maybe it's in something like this, but like, is there any place where you've really changed your mind over the last 30 years? Like, if you were to just look backwards in time at sort of early Chris, and you're sort of beginning as an entrepreneur to where you've landed, in your current situation. Is there anything that you've really noticed that, some kind of significant change in the way that you saw business or the way that you see things?
It's a great question, Ryan. I haven't really had a chance to kind of sit down and ponder on it, but I think if I was to kind of think about it now, for me, it's about realizing that, if you want to go fast, you can go fast, but it's really by yourself. But if you want to go far, it's really with the team. And so for me, I think initially in my career, I was just like kind of bootstrapping it, wanting to do it all myself. And that was quite successful, but it hit a limit, right? And I think you talked a little bit about this as well, Ryan. You get to a point where if you don't replicate yourself or really, bring people along, then you can only go so far. And so for me, I think early in my career, I had some really great growth, but it was kind of focused just around me. And once I made that pivotal shift to really build the right team, particularly early and upfront, and engage partners, that's when I think the business really built long-term value creation and long-term success. And so I think, if I was to look back over 30 years, I think I would tell myself, don't feel like you've got to do it all yourself, but definitely, bootstrap it for the first couple of years and really, lean in aggressively and make that investment in yourself, but also invest in those around you. I think that's where you'll get the biggest results.
I love that. Well, and that was actually the last question I had for you. It was, what advice you'd give an entrepreneur looking to do everything themselves. So you sort of just answered that in answering your own question. So I really love that. Any other sort of, business philosophies, different aspects of business that you might want to talk about that are just, key learnings, insights that you've picked up along the way? Or, we could even talk a little bit more about, how virtual teammate might play into some of these companies in terms of solving those kinds of problems.
Yeah, I think the advice I would give entrepreneurs and I think founders is when you think about the value you bring with your business, and value quite often as an entrepreneur and founder is about money. But if you're adding $1 billion to society, but you're taking $2 billion out, that's not adding value, right? That's a negative value creation. So think about what's the problem you're trying to solve. Always focus on the clients first, but think about how is that improving the way we live, learn, and play. And there are some businesses that are positively involving into that part, and there's some that are maybe not as positively involving in that. And so really think about what is the problem you're trying to solve, and how does that add value and net positive value, not just materially, but also emotional value creation about building the right culture to live, learn, and play, and then spiritual value creation about is being able to do more for a bigger purpose, right? And what is the legacy your business is going to leave, and how does it survive after you? And that's been a big focus for me in the healthcare space. Being a grandparent in the last 3 years, I'm thinking about what's the difference I can make in the healthcare space, really because we're seeing severe burnout, struggles with doctors, and that really wanting to stay in the industry. And if we lose really good healthcare professionals, I'm concerned for the longevity of our healthcare. And so that's probably the advice I would give folks. I'd love to talk to you about, I think on the virtual teammate side, it's really about encouraging entrepreneurs, businesses, think about what's the work you're doing today that isn't the best value of your time. And I think we can all think about those that are really holding your business back. And what's the best solution to do that? It might be virtual teammate, and most of the time it is, but there might be others. But really thinking about how do I focus on those areas and building a team that's here, near, and far. Because I think large businesses have embraced that for a long time. Whether it be BPO or outsourcing, now you have an access to a huge global market. And so how do you embrace and take advantage of that? And that's really the mission that I'm on, to enhance that experience of clients leveraging remote team members and matching really great folks around the world to provide an opportunity to earn a living wage to work with amazing clients like yourself and others.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you so much, Chris. This has been awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to everybody. Here in the closing minutes, do you want to take just a quick minute, let people know where they can track you down online, if they're interested in engaging with Virtual Teammate or learning more, how they can get connected? And, if they'd like to maybe connect with you or meet with you online, how can people do that?
I would love that. Yeah, virtualteammate.com. I would love to go on there, but also always loving interacting with people on LinkedIn. I'm very intentional to be proactive on LinkedIn. So go to Chris McShanag at LinkedIn and would love to learn and meet any or all of your listeners. Also happy to share some information with you, Ryan, about kind of the 100 tasks that you could, as a free resource, that you could delegate to your healthcare virtual teammate or your business virtual teammate. I think there's huge opportunities to start thinking outside of the box. So what are the things that you could delegate? I was just meeting with a healthcare client just recently, and I'll give you a quick story. They had a young lady whose responsibility was to go out and build network and referrals within the LA market for this oral surgeon. And so she was going on maternity leave, and he came to me and said, Chris, is this a task that Virtual Teammate could do? And I said, well, help me understand, what are the outcomes you want to drive? And so the outcomes were, we want more leads, more referrals coming in. And I said, well, how many do you do, and how many should you do a day? And he said, well, somewhere between 2 to 3 a day. And I said, what would the business be like if you could get that to 10? It's like, there's no way you could get to 10. I said, well, let's think about this. If we had a virtual teammate who had the capabilities and had the skills that you needed and the material that you've defined and already built this networking, kind of referral engine, what about if we did that over Zoom? We leveraged DoorDash to get the food provided. We could book 10 a day, right? We could book, every 30 minutes. We can split it out over 8 hours. And we tested it out, and he was able to go from 4 a day to 11 a day and almost double his referrals, at the same time save his cost. And when the lady came back from maternity leave, she then had a team that she could manage versus getting in the car and driving around the LA region and being able to drive more referrals to his business grew. So I think I would encourage your listeners, think about, and it's to be the same on the business side, right? Think about where are areas today that there are limitations. In this area, it was, driving around LA, where you could achieve the same, leveraging the power of technology.
Yeah, no, that's an incredible example. And I think it's, one interesting byproduct of it too, is that actually helps contribute, to your point about, being providing positive outcomes, like, not only within your business, but just sort of in a global sense. Doing that in that case, leveraging DoorDash and other, food service companies and all these different people like that, you're really driving the whole economy. It's not right. Just as small as the one person that you offset with a virtual teammate, so it's interesting how just, leveraging this different tool, I think, can really open people up to different ideas, or maybe allow you to amplify your good.
This lady came back from maternity leave. She now had a bigger role. She could contribute more. It was really a positive net effect.
Yeah, I love that. All right. Well, Chris, one last time. So virtualteammate.com. You can catch Chris McShanag on LinkedIn. He's pretty active over there. We'll leave links in the notes. And I think that's it. So thanks, Chris. It's been awesome. Appreciate your time, man.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a pleasure. You have a blessed day.
Absolutely. And thanks so much to everybody who tunes in the podcast this week and every week. And we'll see you guys next time.